the next question. So the next question says, if inflation begins to rise rapidly, which step is the Federal Reserve likely to take? A, decrease the federal funds rate. B, increase the reserve requirement. C, buy government securities. Or D, decrease the discount rate. And so what we have when we have, so there's two things we have to identify here. First is, what does it mean if inflation is beginning to rise rapidly? And so normally when we think of inflation rising rapidly, we're talking about an expansionary gap where the economy is growing faster than is growing at a faster rate than it can efficiently at the long term, or than it can in the long run, right? And so it's growing too fast, and we want the economy to slow down in growth. The second thing we have to note is, what can the Federal Reserve do to affect the growth rate of the economy? And that really has to do with the money supply. So we're talking about monetary policy here, right? And so no matter what kind of monetary policy the Fed engages in, what it really ends up wanting to do is change the money supply in order to affect interest rates. And so we have the money supply graph here. So we draw a straight line. There we go. So this is interest rates on the y-axis and supply of money on the x-axis. We have QM, which is the quantity of money, and that's this vertical line, the money supply line. We also have the demand curve for money, right? And so anything that the Federal Reserve does in terms of changing the monetary supply is shifting this S kind of line either to the left or to the right. If we're decreasing money supply, then we're shifting S to the left. If we're increasing money supply, then we're shifting S to the right. And we can see that shifting S to the left is going to increase interest rates, and that is going to lead to a decrease in spending, right? If interest rates are higher, then there's less demand for money. Because there's less demand for money, then there's going to be less spending, less investment spending, etc. Meanwhile, if we increase the money supply, we see that we reach a point in time in which there's a decrease in the interest rate, and a decrease in the interest rate is going to stimulate spending by increasing the amount of borrowing for investment spending or borrowing for expenditures of other kinds, right? And that's going to drive up AD and increase the rate of growth of the economy. And so looking at the situation we're in, we know that we want the supply curve to shift to the left, right? We want there to be a decrease in the quantity of money supplied, and that's because we're dealing with an expansionary gap where the economy is growing too fast, and we want to decrease aggregate demand by decreasing spending, and that's what we accomplish by decreasing the quantity of money in circulation. So we know we want some sort of shift that results in this, right? And so we would have QM1. And so the question is now, which one of these answer choices is going to lead to that circumstance in which the supply shifts to the left? So first option we have is option A, which decreases the federal funds rate. And so we have to remember that the federal funds rate refers to the rate at which banks borrow from each other. And so it basically reflects the overall interest rates that are in the market, right? And so decreasing the federal funds rate would be equivalent to decreasing the overall interest rate in the market. And we know that that's not going to be the right answer because we're dealing with a situation in which we want to have higher interest rates, not lower interest rates, and therefore A is going to be incorrect. Excuse me. B talks about an increase in the reserve requirement. And so what the reserve requirement is it's the Fed setting a certain level at which a percentage of all of the bank's deposits must be kept at reserves and the rest can be loaned out. And so we know the reserve requirement affects the money supply by changing the multiplier effect. And so the higher our reserve requirement is, the lower the multiplier effect is, and so the lower the quantity of money that is in circulation will be. And so the effective increase in the reserve requirement is to decrease the multiplier and therefore decrease the quantity of money in circulation. And that seems to be the direction of change that we are looking for when we're talking about this question. So we're going to keep a good eye on that as one of our favorites for the correct answer in this question. C says buy government securities, and so this refers to something the Fed does in terms of open market operations. And what buying government securities does is basically increase the amount of money in supply, and it does so by having the Fed purchase bonds from banks and depositing money into the accounts of the banks, right? And so if banks have suddenly more money, they can loan out more money, and that increases the money in supply or in circulation. So buying government securities is going to give the wrong direction of change. It's going to increase the quantity of money in circulation rather than decrease it. And finally, D says decrease the discount rate, but we know that in our circumstance, we're looking to increase the discount rate, and so D is going to get the direction of change wrong. Is also going to be incorrect. So the right answer here is going to be B, an increase in the reserve requirement. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. The previous tutor said B as well, an increase in the reserve requirements. And they break down inflation as a term used in economics to describe an economic situation wherein the economy experiences growth because of increased spending. When this occurs, the price of the commodities become high and the value of money of the state will be worth less than it was prior. One of the methods used by the Federal Reserve to counter the problems brought on by inflation is to increase the reserve requirement. An increase in the reserve requirement causes the money supply to decrease and interest rates to decrease. And if the reserve requirement decreases, then the money supply will increase and interest rates decrease. If the central bank buys bonds or government securities, the money supply will increase, interest rates decrease, and investment increases. If the central bank decreases this discount rate, the money supply will increase and interest rates will decrease. If the Fed decreases the discount rate, it increases the money supply. All of these actions by the Fed cause inflation to rise rapidly. So yes, there's going to be. This is a pretty good answer. I think the only thing that's unclear is the connection between reserve requirements and a decrease in the money supply. So we're going to clarify that real quick. So increasing the reserve requirement causes the money supply to decrease by requiring banks to hold a larger percentage of deposits in reserve rather than loaning that money out. As a result of a decrease in loans, the money multiplier is decreased, and the overall level of money in the economy is decreased as well. Overall level of money, quantity of money in circulation in the economy is decreased as well. So that's going to be a little bit more of a clarification of the mechanism by which reserve requirement affects the money supply than anything else. But the answer is correct.